Hello once again, choral arranging class. This lecture is for Monday, March 30th. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the beginnings of what you need to know for three-part choral arranging. Before I begin, I want to let you know that I do have some projects and assignments that have been graded, and I am hoping to get those in the mail on Monday. And then I'm also hoping that if I do that, you'll start to receive this graded homework by Wednesday. Maybe some of you, it might take till Thursday, but hopefully it'll come sometime this week. Now, three-part choral arranging gets into chapter 9 of your textbook, and that starts right around page 124. And for the assignment for this week, I'm going to be asking you to just do some reading assignment out of your text. I don't believe I have a written assignment, at least following this lecture. If I get another lecture in later this week, then there will probably be a written assignment for that one. Most three-part arrangements are scored for either SSA or SAB. This would constitute the majority of three-part choral arrangements, SSA or SAB. In this case, we know that the S stands for soprano and the A stands for alto. So here we would have two soprano lines with an alto line, and over here we have a soprano line and alto line. And in SAB, three-part arranging, the B does not stand for bass, it stands for baritone. So in this case we have soprano, alto, and baritone. There are some cases where SAB, well, in fact, there are two instances I can think of where the SAB texture is very conducive and very appropriate to the texture and the type of music that you'd be singing. So the SAB texture is particularly ideal in two common situations. Number one, in a junior high school group, let's put that down here. In a junior high group where the boys with changed voices will sing the baritone part, and then the boys whose voices which have not yet changed, if you have any boys in that age group that have not changed their voices yet, they will sing along with the alto part. And the correct designation for this arrangement, when you have junior high groups and some boys are singing with unchanged voices, whereas some are singing with the changed voices, the baritone part, it is referred to as SCB rather than SAB. And again, here we have soprano cambiata voice and baritone voice. Another instance or situation in which the SAB texture is particularly ideal would be in choirs with few male voices, not very many male voices at all, such as maybe some church choirs or maybe even some high schools where separate soprano and alto parts are balanced by a single baritone part sung by all the males. So if you don't have a lot of male singers, and again it could be a church choir, it could be a high school choir, it could really be any choir where you don't have a lot of male singers, SAB is a good texture because the sopranos and the altos, the ladies, are divided among those two parts, whereas all of the male voices are going to be singing in unison together, the baritone part, for a stronger foundation there. Contemporary arrangers, sometimes instead of using the abbreviations SSA or SAB, they will use the designations Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. Again, this is more of a generic type of labeling for the three individual parts, but some contemporary arrangers will use that system. First of all, I need to tell you that in the SAB arrangement or the SCB arrangement or even the 1, 2, 3 vocal part arrangement, what we have is that the soprano line, the first vocal part, is always notated in treble clef. The second part, the alto part, the cambiata part, or just the general second part, is also notated in the treble clef. But the baritone part, or the third part, is customarily notated in the bass clef. With soprano, soprano, alto, all three of the voices are notated in treble clef. The discussion of Chapter 9 in the text focuses primarily on SSA, three-part texture, and SAB, three-part texture. In three-voice choral arranging, I'm going to begin and spend most of this lecture talking about the homophonic textures for three voices. The homophonic textures being primarily the note against note texture and the animated homophonic texture. We have talked about these two textures in relation to two-voice choral arranging. Now it's time to address these same textures in three-voice choral arranging. For note against note texture, the author uses as an example, example 9.1 in the textbook, a arrangement for soprano, soprano, and alto, or SSA. Now what we need to know at the outset for homophonic textures, both the note against note and the animated homophonic texture, the author makes it clear that the main melody is to be given to the highest part in these homophonic textures. So your main melody is always going to be put in the first soprano, or the topmost part. In the soprano-soprano-alto combination, the other parts are going to be assigned triad members that appropriately harmonize the soprano line. Okay, so we'll put here appropriate harmonization. And especially in the note against note texture, very few non-chord tones are used, if any. All the notes in all the parts belong to the implied or the designated harmony for clarity in the note against note texture. Another thing that I should point out is that when we get to other types of textures for three-voice combinations, such as contrapuntal textures or melodic textures with a background to them, we will find out that the melody does not have to be in the highest soprano voice. In fact, the melody can be moved to other voices. But at least for the note against note texture and for the animated homophony textures, both of those homophonic textures, we want to try to keep the melody in the highest voice. So this is example 9.1 found on page 126 of your text. And you can see that this is an example of a soprano, soprano, alto, a three-part arrangement. We have the accompaniment down here for piano, and we have each of those individual lines written here with text. The name of this piece is called Camelot, and I want to point out first of all the clear note against note texture that I just started talking about. You can see for every note in the melody, which is placed in the highest voice, we have another one note or corresponding note in the second sopranos and also in the alto line for this arrangement. As I mentioned, the melody being here, soprano 2 and alto lines, they have appropriate notes that harmonize the melody notes for the designated or the desired harmonies or chords, which is also being articulated in the piano accompaniment part. Okay. So, a word about the piano accompaniment here. The right hand of the keyboard part duplicates the choral parts, and it also adds a simple rhythmic figure for continuity, especially when we get to these places at the end of the phrase where maybe there's not as much rhythmic activity in the voices, but we need to keep the rhythmic continuity going in the piano. So what I would like to do is I would like to play just the three vocal parts for this example, and I'm going to shrink the size of this a little bit so I can get more of the example shown on the screen. And after I do that, I'll turn on just a little bit of the lights so I can see what I'm performing for you. So it looks like this is about as good as I'm going to get it. Hopefully you can follow along on page 126 in your textbook. This is in the key of F major, and here are the vocal parts only. One thing that's very important to point out about SSA textures, which is what we have here, is that the fundamental bass, or the true bass for the chords that you want to be including for your harmonies, is never given to the alto voice. Okay? The altos are just at a range where they're not going to be able to provide the fundamental bass for the inversions or bass positions of any of the chords in the right register. So we don't give the alto voices the bass pitches for the inversions and or the root positions of the chords. We are going to give that and leave that solely up to the piano accompaniment. And if you can take a look closely, I know it's hard to see, But you can see that the altos, they have their own line that's harmonizing with the two soprano lines. But the fundamental bass is way down here in the left hand of the accompaniment, and that's going to provide the inversions and what have you for the harmonies for an SSA arrangement. One last thing I want to point out about this example before we leave it, which I think is a little bit comical. In the first phrase, the text says, "The winter is forbidden till December." And in the second phrase, the text reads, "And winter exits March the 2nd on the dot." Now, that is a little bit comical, I would think, because I know here in Wayne it just snowed a little bit yesterday afternoon, and it's almost April. So March the 2nd has nothing to do necessarily with the end of winter, at least in Nebraska. Okay, so I just finished talking a little bit about this note against note SSA texture, and the fundamental bass line, as I said, is separated out from the vocal parts. In this case, it's always given to the left hand of the piano, never to the lowest line of the voices, which in this case is the altos. However, when we move to a three-part texture that is SAB, then we have a different situation, and the fundamental bass can be duplicated in the baritone part. And so we'll take a look at an example of SAB texture next. So before zooming out and giving you the entire picture of the whole excerpt on the page, and this happens to be page 128 in your textbook, I'd like to zoom in a little closer on the first phrase so we can really clearly see what's happening here. Notice that this is a three-part arrangement, but this is for SAB texture. Notice the title of this piece is Wind Through the Olive Trees. And we have actually looked at a little bit of this example in prior chapters before, especially the accompaniment part. At any rate, we have note against note texture. You can verify that and see that because every note in the melody, which happens to be placed in the highest soprano part here, the soprano part, is actually harmonized by one and only one note in the alto and also in the baritone part. So we have note against note texture. In fact, you can just look and see how the rhythms of the three parts are identical. That is very common, very true in note against note texture. Now, as I said, whereas in an SSA texture, the fundamental bass is never given to the alto voices, here in an SAB texture, the fundamental bass can be given to the baritone. And if we were to compare, especially on the downbeats of each of these first four measures in the example, we see that the piano accompaniment, which we're in the key of B flat, it starts on a B flat, and so do the baritones. They start on a B flat. The next measure starts on an E flat, and so do the baritones. The next measure has an F in the piano accompaniment on the downbeat, and so do the baritones. And then in the last measure of this phrase, there is a B flat low in the bass for the piano accompaniment, and there is also a B flat in the baritone line. So we can say that frequently, not all the time, but frequently, the baritone line can duplicate the fundamental bass, what is going on at least in the lowest register of the left hand of the piano. I should also point out here before I forget that in any three-part texture, whether it's SSA or SAB, it is not always possible to have a complete chord sound in just three voices. For instance, we know that triads are 3 notes apiece, and we can have complete triad sound in a 3-voice texture. But when it gets to 7th chords, we cannot always have all 4 of the notes of the 7th chord sounding at once in the vocal parts. So we either have to use incomplete 7th chords, that is mostly leaving out the 5th of the 7th chord in the vocal parts, and we're going to rely on the piano accompaniment to fill out the entire 7th chord when we have chords with more than 3 notes, chords that are larger than triads. So the accompaniment is very important in this regard, even more important than the accompaniment is in standard 4-voice choral texture. In 2-voice and 3-voice texture, it is indispensable. Now before I go on, let me talk about the baritone line one more time. We just mentioned that the baritone line can duplicate the pitches in the left hand of the piano, but does that mean that the baritone notes always have to duplicate the fundamental bass, which is in the left hand of the piano? And the answer to that is no. The baritone line actually does not have to be related at all to the fundamental bass notes in the left hand of the piano. Very often the baritone line is related or close to the bass notes of the piano line. Sometimes it shares some notes, but then it has some different notes. So sometimes it's a little mixture. It's related, but it's not exactly the same as the left hand of the piano. And at other times, the baritone line might be not related at all to the left hand of the piano. And in this example here, I noticed, I pointed out to you that the downbeats, at least, of these opening 4 measures in this example, they are duplicated, or they are doubled between the left hand of the piano and the baritone line. But you'll notice, as the baritone line goes through each of the measures in the note against note texture, the baritone line actually goes to different notes that are not on the downbeat in the left hand of the piano. For instance, in the left hand of the piano, the baritone has a D, but the piano does not have a D there on beat 3. Notice how the piano goes up to some other pitches here, whereas the baritone stays on E flat. And F in the 3rd measure is what is sounded in the left hand of the piano, but the baritone uses F, then G, and A, some notes that are not included in the left hand of the piano. This practice or procedure where the baritone line is similar to that of the left hand of the piano, but not exact. What this does is the baritone part in this sense adds all of the following things to the arrangement. First of all, because it's not exactly the same as the left hand of the piano, the baritone line adds harmonic variety to the arrangement. The baritone part, because it has some different notes, notes that are not found in the left hand of the piano, it adds harmonic completeness to the arrangement. These notes also add interest to the vocal line itself, and these extra notes in the baritone line that are not found in the left hand of the piano accompaniment make the line more singable through stepwise motion. And again, it's hard to overestimate and overemphasize how important stepwise motion is to make vocal lines singable. Now, they don't always have to be stepwise, but when you want a vocal line to be smoothed out or to become a little simpler or easier, then maybe fill in some of the skips or take out some of the large skips that you have in your vocal line and fill them in with some stepwise passages, and it'll be easier to sing. For example, if we take a look at the baritone line in this piece, we have a leap of a minor third, but after that ascending leap of a minor third, we have stepwise motion all the way up to the tonic pitch. From B flat starting in the first measure to the upper B flat in the last measure of the phrase. One other thing I'd like to show you about this example before I play this on the piano for you is I noticed this nice part writing going on between the the baritone part and the soprano part. And I don't know if you can see in your text, but we have a voice exchange between those two voices. In measure 3, the sopranos sing A, G, and F. And in measure 3, the baritones underneath them sing the reverse, F, G, and A. So whereas the sopranos had A on the downbeat of measure 3, the baritones have A on the last beat of measure 3. And whereas the sopranos had F at the end of measure 3, the baritones started with the F at the beginning of measure 3. So let's start by listening to just the vocal parts in this example on page 128. A reminder, we are in the key of B flat major, and the meter is 3/4 in this example. I'll also play now the piano accompaniment separate from the vocal parts, so you can kind of maybe get a sense of how the vocal parts connect to or combine with the piano accompaniment. The third and final example I'd like to show you today to illustrate animated homophonic texture. Now, moving away from the note against note texture to the slightly more elaborated animated homophonic texture. The example I'd like to use is example 9.3, and this is found on the very next page in your textbook, page 129. And you can see the title of this piece is The Holly and the Ivy. In fact, this example comes from towards the end, one of the last phrases of the Holly and the Ivy arrangement. And it's notated a little bit differently than the other examples, whereas in the other examples we had a separate staff, a separate line to notate soprano, alto, and bass. Here we have soprano, alto, bass texture again, but the sopranos and the altos are sharing a staff, and not the bass, the baritones. The baritones have their own staff here. Alright, a few words about animated homophony again. You may recall from when we were dealing with two-part arrangements, two-part textures, that an animated homophonic texture is an expansion of the note against note texture in the following way. Basically, the chord tones of the melody are embellished with additional pitches. And usually these additional pitches are your basic non-chord tones. Okay. This texture, animated homophonic texture, is generally chosen to vary a melody that has already been presented in a more simple note against note texture. So again, it doesn't mean you can't use this animated homophonic texture at the beginning of an arrangement. You can, but it does work very nicely after a phrase or two of the note against note texture, then shift to this kind of texture in the vocal parts to get a little bit of variety. When you write in animated homophonic texture, I would suggest, and so does the author recommend, that what you do is you write out a note against note texture with the melody. Usually the melody again will be in the highest voice, but with the SAB texture it doesn't have to be. Anyways, write out a note against note texture with the melody and then change two of the voices, make them a little more active rhythmically by adding passing tones and other basic non-chord tones to enliven the rhythm and animate the texture. In this example, you can see that the melody of the holly and the ivy is given to the sopranos, the upstems in the treble clef here. And you can see that the altos and the baritones have the animated part. It's not exactly note against note texture all the way through. In fact, while the soprano in the melody has longer sounding quarter notes, or even, so basically quarter notes here, we see that the alto and the baritone have running eighth notes to enliven the texture. And you can see that these running eighth notes, along with the melody, all of that is basically duplicated in the piano accompaniment. Now it's important to note here that the baritone line has nothing to do with the fundamental bass, which is found in the lowest voice of the left hand of the accompaniment. The baritone line is actually moving pretty quickly here, whereas the fundamental bass in the left hand of the piano accompaniment is in longer note values. Here we have a low G and a low C, and then G, D, and E. And that particular relationship between the baritone line and the left hand or the fundamental bass of the piano accompaniment is the same throughout this example. In other words, really the baritone line does not have anything to do with the lowest notes that are found in the piano. Once again, this example from the holly and the ivy is really at the culmination of the arrangement towards the end. And you'll notice that in most of the cases, at least in this particular phrase, the animated homophony is generated by adding and using passing tones in the baritone and the alto voices. In fact, I don't really see too many other types of non-chord tones besides passing tones, at least in this phrase. Zooming out and seeing the entire example on this page of your textbook, we can see that the passing motion still is very strong as we go into later measures and later phrases of this example. We can see a lot of passing motion going on, at least in this measure right here. And a lot of, there's passing motion here, I see a little neighbor motion here, and just a lot of eighth notes going on, not only in the piano accompaniment but also in the vocal parts to enliven the texture so that it's not exactly note against note with the melody and the soprano all the way through. This last system here, it looks like the majority of the vocal parts are note against note except for the bass right here, but that is not necessarily true in the upper two systems. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to play, I think I'll play just the piano accompaniment for this particular example so you can kind of hear how it goes in the context of the familiar tune, the holly and the ivy. Here we are in the key of G major. And this is approximately what the accompaniment would sound like. Now, rather than going on to the contrapuntal textures, which is next in Chapter 9 of your textbook, I think I'll go ahead and stop here for today. Like as I said at the top of the lecture, you do not have a written assignment that goes along with this lecture. I would like you, for your homework, to read pages 124 through 131 in your text. And I will go ahead on Canvas and list all this so that it's in great detail, and hopefully you'll be able to understand exactly what the assignment is. So until next time, read about the three-part homophonic textures that I just talked about, and we'll get into the contrapuntal textures next time.